Thanks everyone for joining today's webinar on outsourcing. To outsource or not to outsource? That is the question. Outsourcing has never been so topical at the moment with everything going on, because the need for outsourcing really comes down to the internal requirement for change within your business or the external factors pushing you to change. I'm going to hand over to Mike Curtis, who heads up our services division, to go through this, but just a couple ground rules before we start. Firstly, if you have any questions, please use the question and chat function on your screen, and then they will come through, and at the end we'll cover off any questions that you might have, and we'll get Mike to answer them as and when you need to. So without further ado, I will pass over to Mike to kick things off.
Thanks, Ajay. Morning, everybody. So what I thought I'd do was start by just giving you a little bit of an introduction to myself. So Mike Curtis, I head up the services division there, as Ajay said. I've been in the IT services world for over 20 years now. So I'm on both sides of service provision. So within an organization taking services from external services and running internal provision, but also in a number of different outsource service providers. So what we wanted to do was kind of have a slight introduction and give people a bit of a placement, leveling on from what Ajay said. So whether to insource or outsource, if you like, can be an emotive topic, and especially in today's climate. So we wanted to explore the topic to help people to keep some subjectivity and help you to ensure you can make the right decisions on what's best for your organization's circumstances. So when we talk about insourcing or outsourcing, a lot of the time people get confused as to what we're actually talking about. So we wanted to talk and address some terminology straight off the bat to help people. So it's helpful to start with a clarification and definition of terms. So these are widely used terms that are often confused, as I said, but simply put, outsourcing and insourcing, the provision of service by an in-house team, so onshoring within an in-country, versus outsourcing, where services and job functions are contracted out to a third party. When we talk about outsourcing, there's three main tenets to outsourcing. The onshore within your own country borders, and this is kind of most common and typical for service providers in the UK for IT services at a more localized structure. Nearshoring to neighboring countries within the same time zone. So some people will take certain services that span across Europe, for instance, and have shared service functions, and then offshoring, so the more distant countries. So nearshoring and offshoring is a topic all of its own. The offshoring approach has typically been used to traditionally pursue a cost-saving methodology. It was spawned from the call center-esque type of structures. So lots of people would be familiar, both in business but also in their private lives, with using offshore call centers, for instance. So in terms of that provision, we talk a lot about the provision of offshore services, inshore, nearshore, but really we're talking in this context about providing those services for yourself within your own employment base, or we're using a third party. So why now? We really want to talk about the drivers. So what's really driving us to look at this question of outsourcing? So whether outsourcing services or insourcing, key drivers are typically the same: the search for increased quality, efficiency, and the reductions of costs and risks. They tend to be the areas in which most of us focus on. And since the turn of the millennium, if we go back that far, the trend towards outsourcing really gathered pace. And initially for highly transactional activities, but increasingly that's moved to more line of business activity and some business process outsourcing. And in the last few years, particularly, a small number of organizations have noticed that there is a emerging trend towards larger organizations, particularly moving some of their functions nearshore, so back in-house, in fact, insourcing. So some recent high-level examples would be some large government departments in the UK backsourcing some of its IT function. And IBM have hired about 1,000 developers globally to take back some of its design capability in-house. And similarly, in the aftermath of the 2008 recession, which feels like a really dim and distant memory given where we are with COVID, the payment protection insurance scandal and problems within the banking sector showed a desire to bring some functions back in-house, especially where it involved client interactions, and some of the efforts around the customer journey were at the center of why they did that. So if we move on to talk about some justifications, we wanted to talk about why would you insource? Why would you keep things in-house or bring things back into an organization that may have gone out? So some typical justifications for insourcing can be an organization wanting to create a closer collaboration between its functions in IT, especially if it's pushed a lot of its functions for various reasons to multiple service providers, and it may feel that it's lost that ability to collaborate between functions. The need to drive innovation, in a similar vein, sometimes it's considered that they lose some of that innovative stance where they're locked into certain service provisions and don't have the agility to move within it. Retaining internal resources, especially now where people are looking at the cost of provision of services and the headcounts that they have, there may be a real opportunity to say, yeah, that function that we used to outsource, we'll bring back in-house and retain our staff. And that's really around the opportunity to create an investment in those internal capabilities for yourself. And this can be kind of political or cultural within its sentiment. And there is a push, as I said, against offshoring in certain organizations and verticals due to things like COVID-19, you know, and the practicalities of having some of these functions offshored and remote. And then the accessibility and need for greater control. So those can be considerations in why you would keep stuff in-source. So some of the main other reasons that are cited are generally due to issues which could arguably be alleviated with better planning and management of the relationship with a third-party provider. So that would be things such as a need for greater control driven by stricter regulatory environment, or reputational impact, you know, from the backlash from customers and colleagues where things fell within an outsourced function. So, you know, think about those outsourced call centers where the service is not particularly great, or a failure to realize the promised cost savings or not achieve the expected performance levels that were promised within the original outsourcing agreement. So if we move on to talking about outsourcing and some of the justifications or typical considerations for outsourcing, lower cost is one, due to economies of scale and lower labor rates. So a specialist in a field can generally aggregate a function and provide it cheaper. An increased efficiency, a variable capacity plan that's easier to consume, so things can scale up and down against the organization's need. An increasing focus on a core strategy or competency within the business, so you're not burdened with some of the necessary knowledge and skills to be able to provide that service. Access to skilled resources, so as much as you might have your own internal resource, the cost of some of the skilled technical people to drive some of these services is going up. So it can actually be an accessibility piece around making sure you can get to the timely resources without those specific costs. Time to market as well. You know, if you have problems with your own internal resourcing and your ability to be able to service your customer within your organization, using third parties to help accelerate the timeline to delivery can be beneficial. Lowering the ongoing investment in the internal infrastructure by actually taking some as a service type services, which we would delve down into another thread at a different time in terms of what infrastructure to have in-house or to outsource. Access to innovation and intellectual property and thought leadership from people who have experiences wider than just your business area. So, accessibility to that can be key to drive your business forward, where you don't have to make some of the flaws and stumble over some of the mistakes that others have in the past. And also, a possible cash influx resulting from transfer of assets from a new provider, for instance. So if you go to a DaaS type service, you can, where you've made capital expenditure, you can actually gain some money back by going to more of a lease type model, for instance. So with those steps in mind, those considerations rather, what we wanted to do was talk about some typical steps to help with the decision-making process when you're looking at whether or not to take some of this stuff back in-house or outsource. So step one that we think is advisable is to consider your drivers. So having prepared business cases and securing the internal buying to look at moving a function, you should find these processes mean that you have a clearer driver behind the decision. So some questions that you could include in this stage would be, is there a definite need that is being met? For example, is your business case based around an increase in quality? And if it is, why is that needed? Is there a change that is feasible in the context of the potential disruption to the organization, for instance? Is the change sustainable over a longer term? Are you taking the problems and putting them out of reach? So it could be seen that, if we just put that into that data center service provider, they'll look after it all and the problem's gone away. That sort of silver bullet approach to some of the outsourcing issues. And then the core capabilities for your business. Is it a core function that you're looking to outsource, which comes with a greater perceived risk? Or is it a peripheral function? So is it more of a commodity service that you can actually take and that won't affect the line of business if there is a particular issue? The next step, which I would advise you that you consider, is ensuring the quality is achievable. So in this context, any good service provider should be able to support you with the appropriate evidence and collateral to help you with answering at least a few of the following questions. What are your requirements in terms of the necessary checks and balances to benchmark the performance of your service provider, be that internal or outsourced? Is the service clearly defined enough, but flexible enough to provide the effective control and cope with the changes in requirements? So oftentimes people look at an entry point to a service and then forget to consider how that would scale up or indeed back with the change in demands on their business. And would quality suffer in that context if you ask a service provider to ramp up quickly, for instance? And does your chosen provider have the capability to deliver your requirements, both now, as we've discussed, but in the future, based on that variability? And what sort of structure do you have contractually to be able to support that? So the third step is to consider the secondary impacts. So this one, I think, is often overlooked by people when initially looking at whether or not to outsource a particular service or function. So a common mistake for organizations doing this for the first time, or often not the first time, is a failure to account, as I say, for those secondary impacts in that outsourcing model. So things like, has the potential resource requirement for managing the provision been factored in internally? So once you've outsourced that function, do you have the skills internally to be able to effectively manage that outsource relationship status? What effects will there be on that outsourcing provision on the people that are in your organization, be that career progression or talent retention, or just the focus for individuals, the ownership of particular solutions and technologies? What impact on people at that level And will the impacts on your ability to innovate and evolve be affected in a negative way? So yes, we've outsourced, we have that function, now it's become quite static, and we find it difficult because now we don't have the retained knowledge of that system or solution. We might not potentially have the ability to react as quickly enough. So thinking about those types of effects, really important. So making sure that you've got the need to work through that is really important. Planning carefully is really important. Making sure that you can minimize the disruption as much as possible when you're focusing on that. And the more time that you focus on the KPIs and the metrics that can be agreed, it's money well spent, time well spent to look at the appropriate structure. So it remains vital that there's clear oversight within your business for that. And any good outsourcing partner will really help you to specify the needs, particularly that you have, and make sure that you're in a position that you've got the right contractual environment to maintain the service in that structure. So if we move on to talking about the portfolio approach, there's no one-size-fits-all solution in terms of insourcing or outsourcing. Any decision whether to engage with an external provider or bring a function back in-house or similarly leave things as they are should be judged on its own merits. So within the context of a portfolio approach, a range of specialist providers with some retained services being provided internally is usually the best answer. So the precise profile of the variety of those services will change and vary from business to business and organization to organization. So as your business grows and matures, the need to have different elements under control in-house or outsourced to a specialist provider will certainly change. So it's important to review the requirements regularly. And in our experience, the right provider for a service depends on a range of factors. And those factors typically include looking at the organizational size, the organizational structure, the sector that you work in, the markets that you're in, and the growth stage that the organization is at. And sometimes it's pertinent to use, based on those factors, outsourcing, and those conditions change. So it's worth remembering that depending upon where you are, taking each scenario in its own merits and adopting a measured approach is really vital to finding the right solution in each area. So these things can be mixed up and create very unique situations for organizations that lend them to do things differently to a neighboring organization in the same sector or a competitor. It's not one rule to rule them all. So it's worth remembering as well that outsourcing has evolved significantly over time to create, a really mature market that offers increasingly sophisticated solutions. So it doesn't have to be, very kind of piecemeal solutions. You can provide experiences that are professional enough to engage in conversations regarding, lots and lots of different opportunities. So my advice would be, bear in mind the point in an organization's life cycle and where they may be most appropriate to bring a particular service or discipline back in-house. So final thoughts on outsourcing particularly. We'd say successful outsourcing is about a trusted relationship and a governance structure. So what we wanted to do is make sure that we have a good outsourcing governance structure. It's the single most important factor in determining the success for an outsourced deal. So without it, without the careful negotiation and documented outcomes, we risk not seeing the promises that were made, and these things may not be realized, and the relationship that then develops may not look like what we envisioned in the first place. So what we really want to do is make sure that we don't just focus on the IT service itself. Obviously, that's an important aspect, but much more of this is around the trusted relationship and governance model and the ability to be able to ensure that you receive the benefits against those initial objectives as you've outlined them, with enough consistency and flexibility, obviously, to be able to sustain where the business is. So hopefully that's kind of a structured way in which you can look at, and obviously we'll make these slides available so people can look back through them and have some of the points in iteration. But I wanted to kind of pause at this point and go more into questions for people.
Thanks, Mike. If anyone has any questions, if you don't mind putting them in the chat, there are a couple that came through midway through that. But if there's any more, please share. First one, Mike, was sorry, I'm just changing it. Okay, so it's around what the services, what services are best to start with. You know, where do you begin, Mike? If you're going to look at outsourcing, where do businesses typically start with that?
Yeah, so a lot of the time, the low risk areas to start, as I said, are within the more commodity-based services. So what we mean by that is things that don't directly affect line of business service provision. So if we think as a provider in your business, you are accountable and maintain the accountability for the service outcome that you're delivering to your end user. So if you're giving that responsibility to a third party, there's a risk element in there. So if it's the first foray into those outsourcing services, look at the things that are more commoditized. And I use this expression of analogy of a restaurant. Lots of restaurants now will buy their vegetables pre-chopped because it doesn't give them any sustainable advantage in their business in terms of the taste of the food, but actually it takes away some of that stuff for themselves. So I say, who's chopping the carrots? So it's functions like that where you can say, actually, this is something that's a commodity. It doesn't affect our business negatively. It certainly doesn't give us competitive advantage by outsourcing that service. So it's a less risk option. So, for instance, a printing estate in a lot of organisations, is one place to start looking at the provision around something like that. Shorter term resourcing models, so to backfill some of your resourcing within an organisation, looking into things that are back office functions like your backup services, looking into areas where you might want to be able to have the benefit of the service, but obviously not want the investment, like setting up SOC, some of the management aspects of ongoing maintenance contracts. Those things can be outsourced without an effect on the line of business services in the first instance.
I guess to add to that, or to add a follow-on question to that, Mike, do you feel there's an element of a misconception as a business grows that they have to bring more in-house, so that it kind of naturally correlates? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so what we've generally seen was in certain organizations, there was a rush to outsource almost in totality. And what that did was took some of the inherent knowledge out of an organization. So essentially what we see with many organizations is they retain a core of IT professionals, people that can translate their business requirements, manage some of their service outcomes for themselves, but actually then have the means to be able to facilitate the adoption of third-party providers within their model, so they're giving best value back to a business. So sometimes, as organizations grow, people tend to overinflate the number of people they need, and certainly you'll see the pressures at the moment where people are really looking into their IT organization and saying, do I really need that number of resources in order to be able to provide this service? Could I do that cheaper? Do I really need to have that guy changing those tapes, for instance? Could their time be better spent on something else particularly? So conversely, small organizations, may traditionally apply the approach that, they're a small company, so that they'll have an IT guy who does it all themselves, and that can actually stifle some of the growth within a company itself. We've experiences of talking to organizations where they just don't have the time to do the proactive things they want to do to move a business forward because they're embedded in the maintenance mode, as we call it, the kind of managed service element of the operational type things, so it's the necessary but not very urgent stuff, if you like, that people hold on to.
You mentioned value and cost within that, Mike. There's the question here. The next question is, how do you determine cost of professional services? I guess you're looking at total cost of ownership there, right?
Yeah, so a lot of the time people will look towards return on investment, if you like, so if it's a professional service engagement structure, they'll be looking at a day rate and what they get in the context of a day rate return. If it's more into an ongoing line of business, really you should be looking at the total cost of ownership for the life cycle of that service. So in many instances there's a cost to come out of a service as well as there is to go into one, and that's really one thing that's forgotten. A lot of times people are looking at the cost going into it and don't have that. We've had some examples most recently where we've been talking to new organizations that have existing contracts for managed print environment, which they now want to reverse out of because of changes within their business structure to do something different, and the cost of exit is really prohibitive. So they're stuck into a contract for another couple of years that's not fit for purpose, and that's a real cost to them at the moment. And it was unfortunate. It's one of those lessons that gets learned the hard way. So I'd like people to really make sure that they consider that on the way into a service contract, that they understand how much it costs them to get out.
Thanks, Mike. Any other questions? We're just going to pause for a minute to see, just in case. Whilst we wait for that, Mike, if you don't mind going to the next slide for me, I can just explain what's coming up.
A little bit of a pause.
There we go. Thank you. So coming up on the 2nd of July, we have Sophos joining us to talk about the state of ransomware. So they've done a very detailed and thorough research into what ransomware looks like right now. So we're going to really cover off some quite honest questions through that. And then on the 16th of July, we're going to be working with Nutanix to talk about simplifying the path to public cloud. So when is the right time to be looking at public cloud, but also how do we get there in the most simplest form, but also see return on investment from doing that as well. After that, we're still in the process of defining what's next. So again, we base these all on feedback. The one on Sophos has come from a security request, same from the cloud side. So if you have any ideas, please share them, and then we'll make sure we do the research and get some content together for you guys. There hasn't been any further questions, so I would probably say on that note then we'll close things out, and thank you everyone for joining, and thank you, Mike, for hosting today's webinar.
Yeah, thanks very much. Just last final thought is, if people have any questions, things specifically, obviously reach out to us, go through your account management structure, and we'll do our best to give you the right advice.
Brilliant. Thanks, everyone.